In and of itself, revisions are not a big deal. They're a very normal activity. Historians, this is what we do. We always sort of argue back against established wisdom. So what's happening now is that this seems very political. And in our times, there is a conscious desire for Hindu heroes. People feel like specifically Muslim figures have got too much space in textbooks, and therefore that needs to be rectified and corrected. There is some risk that this kind of meddling might end up having some very real-term consequence. That at some point in the distant future, if somebody genuinely starts believing Taj Mahal was Tejo Mahalaya, I wouldn't be too surprised. The point is to teach kids complexity. Teach them that societies are complex, political history is complex. Things don't always have black and white answers. Things are not always right and wrong. Sometimes they're mixed up in strange ways.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining me on Table Talk. Another day, another great guest, another great issue. But if you have not subscribed to my YouTube channel Jyotsna Mohan, please do quick like and subscribe so that we all feel like we are wanted and our content is resonating with all of you. So I am quickly going to go ahead and chat with author and historian Manu Pillai today, and we're looking at the change in NCERT books where Mughal rulers and emperors and the history that we have read seems to have completely disappeared. But what it means to be an author and a historian talking of these issues, what it means for our children and the knowledge that they're getting.
Manu, I think this is the third round of revisions in the last 8 years when it comes to our textbooks and the NCERT books. My first question actually is this par for the course? Is this something that, you historians are used to?
Revisions of textbooks is not an unusual activity because, as more and more research comes into play, a lot of conclusions that prior generations of historians might have reached, they obviously get revised, which means there must be a reflection in the academic texts also, in what kids in school are learning. So to illustrate, now in a lot of studies on ancient India, let's say Harappa and so on, that period, you'll find that there's increasingly a lot of genetic evidence and scientific evidence that's being marshaled, which didn't exist, say, 50 years ago, even 25 years ago in the same way that it does today. So when I was studying in school, our knowledge of the Harappan civilization, of the Indus Valley civilization, was very much based on what earlier generations had done without these scientific tools. Whereas today, there's a series of books, there's a series of studies that have shown that there are certain conclusions you can confirm, there are certain theoretical aspects that have now been shown to be true, other things that may have to be revised, which means those need to come into textbooks as well, going forward from here. So that, in and of itself, revisions are not a big deal. They're a very normal activity. Historians, this is what we do also. We always sort of argue back against, established wisdom. And we try and sort of push the argument, we try and evolve the field and so on. Although what's happening now is that, this seems very political, which is why I suppose more and more people seem to suspect that this is not purely an academic exercise, that this is linked to perhaps ideological needs or plain politics and so on. And that also would not be surprising. It's not unprecedented in India. About 22 years ago, there was a similar effort, and there was a huge controversy back then also. Now we're seeing something similar. As you said, these efforts have been happening for some time. So if this was happening in isolation, that would be one thing. But considering that there are politicians actually standing in political pulpits and campaign stages, talking about how we're going to rewrite history and so on, and then something that people understandably find it a bit suspicious.
Coming to the Mughals, such a huge part of our history, at least mine, and growing up, learning, reading, okay, so for the layman who will turn around and say, chalo, okay, the Mughal gardens have been renamed, but what the heck, carry on. But that's just a side bit of it. The fact that to turn around and actually obliterate so much of that, where would that put our history? Because in that whole pluralistic history that we have grown up knowing.
It reminds me of an old story. In the early 19th century, the last Peshwa, who was the head of the Maratha Confederacy before he was toppled in 1818, Bajirao II, there was this one text called the Sahyadri Khandam of the Skanda Purana, which apparently in his final, in the reign of the final Peshwa, he tried to go around and destroy copies of this particular text because it used to contain something that was embarrassing to him as a Chitpavan Brahmin, which was, a story about the origins of the Chitpavans and so on. And he found that embarrassing because it basically suggested that they were not as grand as they'd become in the Peshwa period. So he tried to wipe this out. And that's what, this whole controversy reminded me of, the selective sort of erasure of certain things, highlighting of other things and so on. Ostensibly, the argument is that the Mughals have been hyped up, and that is why this is a kind of course correction. Whereas I think that it may seem to a lot of people, in fact, when I did a video recently, I sensed from some of the responses that a lot of people do believe the Mughals occupy too much space in textbooks. There may be some truth to it, because there is a general North India bias whenever we do Indian history in textbooks. And that because the Mughals conquered and ruled so much of North India, automatically there's an overlap there also. I think one of the reasons the Mughals occupy the kind of space they do is because they were the last imperial formation in India before the British took over and the British Raj came into being. Even the East India Company, although they were ruling from 1760s itself in Bengal, they ruled as subordinates of the Mughal emperor. The Marathas began as rebels against the Mughal emperor, but by the middle and late 18th century, they actually became official custodians and protectors of the Mughal emperor. Mahadji Scindia, for example, even had a title from the Mughals. The Peshwa was given a title, and they were kind of, formally speaking, still vassals of the Mughals. All the way south in Kerala, the Maharajas of Travancore got their titles endorsed by the Mughal emperor. So the Mughals, therefore, as cultural icons, as a symbolic force in India, remained very prominent all the way till the middle of the 19th century. And to put that into perspective, the last Mughal emperor, he was toppled in 1858, and Gandhiji was born in the next decade. So it's not even like the Mughals sat some 5 centuries ago. It's relatively recent in time. Now, because of that reason, we've got more information on them. The British were obsessed with them, so they've got lots of material they've created. We've got Persian texts, we've got local texts, we've got texts created by the subordinate vassals about the Mughals. We've got buildings that are still in front of our eyes. If you go to a city like Delhi, it's packed with Mughal monuments and tombs and the fort and the palaces and so on. They were the last prominent Indian empire that was around before the British took over. They cast a very long shadow over the British Empire itself.
So, I wanted to actually ask you, given the background, given the space that they've held, and they've held it for so very long, despite all those changes that have come and gone, it's only now that these changes have hit them. Is it going to be very easy to remove them?
I'm actually split on this, because there are people who say, you can scrape them out of the textbooks, but you can never take them out of our imagination and so on. That, I think, is a bit too optimistic, because, once textbooks start getting rewritten, it's not like everybody in our country has some voracious appetite for history to start with. Most people, including the ones who are chattering on Twitter about how awful the Mughals were, their cheap exposure to the Mughals is purely what they read in school, and then what they've imagined since, by reading newspapers or watching films and so on. So once you take something like textbooks and then meddle around and sort of mess around with them, there is a real risk that things that deserve a certain amount of attention get deflated. Equally, it's also possible that certain things that supply certain ideological support systems, etc., might end up being amplified beyond any kind of reason. So there's always mischief in that. However, that said, we still have phenomenal monuments. We still have the Mughals alive in a lot of the food we eat. In North India, a lot of the clothes that people wear. At every wedding, all these, the kind of clothes that are worn both by men and women, there are strong influences of Persianate culture in general, but also the Mughals from later periods. A city like Delhi, it's very difficult to walk 2 kilometers without running into something or the other that's connected. Whether it's the gardens, whether it's obscure little tomblets, not even the big tombs, but the smaller ones, and so on. So it's not that easy to erase it in a physical sense, but I think people can be villainized, historical figures can be marginalized, and the importance of the Mughals in our broader consciousness can certainly be reduced, which is, I think, what the aim really is. It is that in this climate and in our times, there is a conscious desire for Hindu heroes. People want Hindu heroes. People feel like specifically Muslim figures have got too much space in textbooks, and therefore that needs to be rectified and corrected. So I think there is some risk that this kind of meddling might end up having some very real-term consequences. But all the same, I don't think I'm too pessimistic either, because there's a very strong material evidence, and there's still a kind of living cultural resonance that continues in our own times and in our own lives and in our food and so on.
What about misappropriation? One thing is to, just take it out. The other thing is to misappropriate. Taj Mahal hamara tha. That kind of narrative. How does that, and there are enough
Yeah, I
people
think
out there who are willing to listen.
it's funny how many people these days seem to believe this whole Tejo Mahalaya theory, that this used to be a temple called Tejo Mahalaya, and which is now, and then Shah Jahan seized it and turned it into Mumtaz's grave, and that's how it became the Taj Mahal. There's a similar story for the Qutub Minar also, where they say that this is, what is it, something's thumb, and it wasn't actually built by the slave dynasty of Delhi, and so on. I think, see, these stories will fly to a certain extent. The real fear is that when this kind of belief system starts penetrating academic spaces also, when, for example, scholars start buying into this and you have like very serious people endorsing or even willing to let this kind of stuff pass, I think that's where the risk really lies. Misappropriation, although in India we do have a habit of reclaiming things by telling powerful stories. Back in the day also, forget Hindu versus Muslim, we have so many, especially in South India, we have so many sites that used to be Jain temples, Buddhist temples, which were then later, once those religions declined, they were appropriated by what we would now call Hinduism, but in those days used to be a much more complex, mixed up set of beliefs and practices. It was appropriated by them and turned into temples. So you'd have various stories that come up. Where I come from in Kerala, we have a temple nearby which is about 1,200 years old. But what's interesting is that the local, and there's an inscription that says it's 1,200 years old. The local Sthala Puranas, however, say, oh, this was built in this particular yuga, long before the Kali Yuga and so on, which gives it a history of 4,000, 5,000 years. And yet it was originally a Buddhist place of worship, because the image of the Buddha was found buried in a field near the temple about 100 years ago. So it's interesting how places have been occupied this way in the past. It's interesting how places and sites and sometimes legends and stories even have been reclaimed and appropriated. I mean, the whole business of the Buddha becoming an avatar of Vishnu is also partly taking him and then putting him into a worldview that you prefer, rather than taking him with the worldview that he actually introduced. So there's that kind of thing it's happened in the past in India. So I wouldn't again play it down. It sounds foolish to us, but frankly, in a world of emotions and so on, as opposed to the world of dry facts and academic analysis, in a world of emotions, telling compelling, powerful stories does have value and does have a lot of power. And that, I think, could mean that at some point in the distant future, if somebody genuinely starts believing Taj Mahal was Tejo Mahalaya, I wouldn't be too surprised. And the thing is, there's always a small grain of truth in these things, right? Which is that the plot on which the Taj Mahal stands did belong to a Rajput Raja who had his own private sort of puja room or whatever in that particular place. It was from that Rajput Raja, I think, that Shah Jahan purchased that property, for which the Rajput was given other property and compensation and so on, and then the Taj Mahal was built. So I think there is a grain of truth in that. The plot was originally a Hindu's property before the Taj Mahal was built there, which is what some people use to construct a longer genealogy and saying that the Taj Mahal itself came from Rajput times, or that it had Hindu builders and creators and so on. So again, I wouldn't play it down too much. A lot of this seems stupid, but stupidity does fly. Stupidity does acquire a life of its own, and it does have the capacity to alter reality itself.
Is there some sort of a worry now that, with the kind of changes that have been made, that it's the smaller stories, the stories of women, also in the Mughal era, that are going to get impacted?
I mean, women's stories have already been difficult to bring up in the first place. If you look at the first generation of Indian historians who worked on the Mughals, like Jadunath Sarkar and so on, the women weren't such a big part of their historical analysis. They weren't necessarily seen as worthy historical figures. It's much later generations, really in the last 30, 40 years only, who've actually brought it up and started focusing on these women as political actors and not just as domestic beings locked up in the harem doing nothing in particular other than sort of perfuming themselves and sitting around and lounging about waiting for the Sultan or the Mughal emperor to arrive. So there is already, but telling their stories already has been a bit of an uphill challenge for a lot of scholars. And I think you're right. Therefore, there is a risk that a lot of these things will recede in this black and white Mughals were villains and everybody else were these pious, wonderful souls kind of argument that is there. So it is possible that they might fall victim to it. Also, the women sometimes tend to complicate some of these black and white narratives, right? So even the Rajput wives that the Mughal emperors took, it wasn't like these were docile women or weak women and so on. Yes, they were originally married to, I mean, so-called Jodhabai, whose actual title was Mariam-uz-Zamani. She was married to Akbar very much as part of a political alliance, but she was a political force in her own right. By the time her son, Emperor Jahangir, was in power, she had a huge amount of influence in the Mughal court. She had a high cavalry rank. She had a huge economic portfolio. She used to trade in different parts of the world. She had all these charitable projects that she was overseeing. You have others like Gulbadan Begum, who I think was Akbar's aunt. This particular Begum goes on the Hajj for 6-7 years. She disappears from Mughal India, goes all the way to Arabia, just a band of women, of course with soldiers and protectors, but led chiefly by this aunt of the emperor. She negotiates with the Portuguese. They refuse to let her go. She's stranded for a whole year. She ends up actually leaving after that. Fascinating adventure led by a woman. So none of these women were docile figures. None of these women were just sitting around. These were interesting people, interesting stories. And I think some of that might indeed be obscured in this simplistic narrative that increasingly is peddled these days.
It's quite simplistic, isn't it? I mean, now you've come across lots of people who are, going about saying, oh, we didn't study about the Chola Empire, or we didn't study about this empire. Why didn't we only study about the Mughals?
A lot of people, because their exposure to history firstly ended in class 10 or whatever, and after that they haven't bothered to pick up anything to do with history. Firstly, you're relying on your memory of what you studied then. Secondly, once 20 people start saying that, oh, we only studied the Mughals, we didn't study anything else, you start believing it, right? Because if I think back about the things I certainly studied Vijayanagara, I certainly studied the Cholas. We did hear about how the Cholas went out into Southeast Asia with their ships and so on. Again, they may not necessarily have had chapters and chapters, for example, like the Mughals did. Although the Mughals also, in my textbooks, did not necessarily dominate large chunks either. There was usually a section allocated to Akbar as this exemplar of Hindu-Muslim unity and so on, and then there was a section associated with Aurangzeb. But the Aurangzeb section was also dominated by the Marathas, by the rise of Shivaji and so on. So it's not as if somehow you have all the others cramped into 20 pages and the Mughals have the remaining 80 pages. The Mughals do have a sizable chunk, but that's also because they come from times that are closer to our own. Therefore, we have got more information. To expect similar kind of data on the Cholas to fill that kind of space or to compete with the Mughals in terms of how much space is allocated is difficult because we don't have that kind of information on the Cholas. What we have are, of course, largely inscriptional material. We've got buildings, we've got some Sanskrit works and so on, but that's relatively limited compared to the wealth of material that the Mughals have left. Secondly, because the Mughals were an Islamicate dynasty, they were recognized in the wider Islamic world, which means the corpus of evidence that we can rely on is not just in India. It exists in Portugal, it exists in the Ottoman Empire, it exists in the Persian Empire. There are links between all of these. Noor Jahan was Persian. It's the same Persian families. One branch would come off to the Mughals, one branch would come to the Deccan Sultanates in South India, and then these families would intermarry with these royal families here and get mixed up and so on. So there are lots of linkages and networks that also make it possible to tell the Mughal story in a greater, richer kind of style. And finally, we study the Mughals a lot more simply because their impact on our world as it is today, simply because they were so close to us in time, is higher. Whereas the Cholas lived almost like 800, 900 years ago. They collapsed and dissolved by the 13th century. Yes, we have the temples and certain aspects are alive, but not in the same way. So they didn't necessarily, so the British didn't inherit power or take over power from the Cholas. They took it from the Mughals. That itself creates a lopsidedness in why we end up studying the Mughals more and the Cholas less. Of course, there is every reason to study more about the Cholas as much as we can. There's every reason to highlight stories from the kind of margins of Indian history, and there are plenty. As I said, there's a geographical bias. I don't know why nobody complains about how we don't study anything about the Northeast. That's also a very valid point because we barely study anything about the Northeast. We learn very little about ancient Kashmir or medieval Kashmir even. South India again gets a kind of stepmotherly treatment. So yes, there are valid criticisms to be made, but the answer isn't necessarily to erase the Mughals and then try and play up others. It's to create richer textbooks, it's to make more interesting texts, it's to come up with new creative ways of teaching history and to amalgamate all this in reasonable proportions as is necessary. But that requires, I think, to start with a sincerity and a kind of loyalty to the discipline itself as opposed to a desire to turn history into a kind of instrument for other ideological or political battles. If that's the game we are playing, no textbook is ever going to be perfect. If I don't think any Indian government has actually been interested in history for its own sake. Everybody's been interested in history as it supports politics, as it supports our narrative as a post-colonial nation, as it sort of bolsters our present, not necessarily for history in its own right as a discipline.
When we're targeting young minds, the children, the NCERT books, when books become a playground.
Barely any kids seem to be interested in history at that age because it's taught badly enough to start with. The textbooks aren't particularly inspiring to start with. I think and the textbooks are so bad that in some ways we should perhaps be happy that the Mughals occupy most of it, because otherwise everything else would be turned into a boring account of what happened in the past and 5 dates and so on. So I think there's that. But I think kids will be poorer for it. Their comprehension of how our country emerged in its current shape, in its current form, will be skewed. Our understanding of political history will be skewed. Even if we shut our eyes and think of India and we visualize the map of India, a lot of the creation of this map is linked to the British, but also to the Mughals. Because it's partly in these periods that the kind of political unity we have today was forged, before which it was almost 2,000 years ago, in Ashoka's time, that we had that kind of unity and political unity. So even in understanding our political history, it's extremely important to speak about the Mughals. So we can talk about them critically. We can certainly interrogate them. We can certainly discuss the Mughals without rose-tinted romantic, ideas about how they were wonderful and everybody seemed to get along in their time. And then India was the richest. There's this whole thing, right? Like India was the richest nation in the world during Mughal rule. It's a bit of an exaggeration because the ruling classes were definitely very rich, but most Indians were not very rich. That's just how it is. But again, that's not specific to the Mughals. It's specific to kingship as an institution. The point is to teach kids complexity. The point is to not give kids a simplistic fare of this happened, this happened, this happened, history lesson done, but to teach them that societies are complex, political history is complex, things don't always have black and white answers, things are not always right and wrong, sometimes they're mixed up in strange ways. Historical figures, you take even a Mughal emperor like Akbar, who's supposed to be the good Mughal emperor in quotes, he also had so-called negative shades, he also had so-called positive shades, he was also an eccentric, interesting human being if you look at him purely from that perspective, but it's the combination of all this that makes him a person, right? And I think that complexity needs to be communicated to kids instead of turning history into a political football that will just bore them even more than they are already with our existing data.
So, you're one of my favorite storytellers, and I love the episodes and the anecdotes you pick up. So there's anything that comes from Mughal history that
and you think we I'm not an expert on the Mughals. You'll have to call someone who specifically studies the Mughals for it. I think, one character who interests me very much is Babar, the first Mughal emperor, because he's seen as the invader, right? Like, this is the guy who first invades India, and he was an invader. So even if the later Mughals settled down, Babar definitely came here as an invader. He conquered from local Hindu Rajas, though of course the main person he defeated wasn't a Hindu, it was Ibrahim Lodi of the Lodi dynasty in Delhi. So Babar was an invader, and therefore people have this very ferocious idea of Babar as some kind of villainous figure with just missing horns and so on. But if you actually read Stephen Dale's biography of Babar, for example, the image you get in your mind is of a very confused young man, deprived of his patrimony in Fargana, where he was from, at a relatively young age. He saw his sister being married to one of his own tormentors. At one point, he was surrounded barely by 5 or 6 friends and sleeping rough on a hillside. He had to actually go and woo the Persian Shah, briefly pretending he had become a Shia Muslim in order to win support, and then he comes back to becoming a Sunni. Even his sensational defeat of the Rajputs, he actually thought he was going to lose, because his troops had suffered several defeats and reversals by then, and that's when he famously throws off the liquor jars and smashes all of that and says, "No, I will not drink anymore, and this is going to be a holy war," and so on. This whole holy war in his case wasn't necessarily because he came here, saw Hindus and said, "I hate Hindus." It was because he'd suffered so many defeats that the only thing that would build up morale for his army was finally invoking God and falling back on religion, because nothing else would motivate them to this fight, because they'd already suffered so many losses. He hated the climate. He didn't actually like living here. A lot of his governors, a lot of his supporters ended up going back to Afghanistan and beyond because they couldn't stand living in India. So if you just look at some of their lives, you'll discover that actually these were deeply conflicted figures. We may now see Babar as this tyrannical figure who came from outside and conquered this place as if he had a set plan from the beginning. But if you actually scrape beneath the surface and investigate these figures, you discover that so much was luck, so much was chance, so much was unplanned, and so much just happened. And this is true of all empires and all kings. Even the British Empire, a lot of it was, it surprised the British themselves, sometimes how easily they won certain battles. Even something like the Battle of Plassey, Clive wasn't sure till the previous night whether he should go ahead or not with it, because he genuinely thought he would end up losing. And yet that's not what happened. So those surprises are what in some ways make history fascinating. That's what makes Mughal history fascinating, but it's what makes all history fascinating. That we think that these guys somehow in a linear way went from step one to step two. But no, just as our lives, our choices are messy, just as we begin in point A and then end up at different points that we never even imagined we'd reach, these guys also began in certain places, but ended up in places that were not entirely reached by design, but a lot of it was reached simply by accident and luck. That aspect, I think, fascinates me in general and comes across very well in Babar's life.
History is fascinating. What is it like being a
Well,
historian in these times?
being a historian is always slightly exhausting in the sense that there's a lot of reading to be done, a lot of research can exact its pound of flesh. It can be a very isolating experience. I'm in the process of finishing up a book. It'll take me several more months, but I just finished a chapter and I've been breaking my head on it for the last 5 or 6 weeks. And reading through reams and reams of Marathi text and some relatively archaic Marathi. And I finished one draft last week and I gave myself this entire week just to while my time away and not look at the manuscript, not look at the book, just to relax. Of course, I ended up doing other kind of writing. So those stresses, of course, continue as part of professional work in general. But in these times, yes, I think there's a general belief lots of people have that anybody can just come and express an opinion on history and be taken seriously, which I find quite comical. It's almost like me deciding tomorrow that I'm going to open up the bonnet of my car and just look at some kind of like online YouTube manual and start tinkering with the car itself. I'm not an expert, and yet I would never have the confidence to go and start tinkering with the engine of my car. And yet with history, somehow everybody thinks it's about opinion rather than, the actual analysis and the facts. Historians are also trained people. It's not like we just wake up in the morning and we decide to do history as a hobby. There's training. We keep getting better with time. We keep getting better with experience. Our books, therefore, keep getting more and more robust and sound because of that. There's a lot of effort that goes into training as historians as well. And that, I think, is sometimes underestimated by people. Then, of course, there's the political mudslinging and so on. You write something, some party doesn't like it, and all of their trolls will come and attack you. You write something else, another party in a different part of India won't like it, they'll come and attack you. So it's but that's again, I wouldn't complain too much. It's part of the process these days, especially if you're writing for larger audiences. Inevitably, there will be more opinions to deal with. If I were writing just for a seminar circuit, I would only have to deal with the 20 people in the seminar. But if I'm writing for a larger audience, then I am going to have to put up with comments that are not always very enlightened, comments that are sometimes fairly presumptuous. Sometimes on Twitter, for example, you'll answer somebody, they'll ask a question, you answer, and then a third person will come and saying, where is the proof? And I'll be like, no, this particular text. No, give me the exact sentence and verse. And I'm like, why should I do this for you? It costs me money to do my research. Why should I come and freely give you all this information and tell you which exact verse to find this in? And who exactly are you? Why am I going to respond to a nameless figure on Twitter and try and go through all my sources trying to find and assuage them that, oh, this is really genuinely history. So there are some irritants like that. But again, it still remains a joy. It still remains a fascinating world. For all the nonsense that happens in its name, for all the politicking that's done around history, it still never ceases to surprise me. It still never ceases to fascinate me. And frankly, if you go into history with an open mind, as opposed to having prejudgments and preconceived ideas, you will find that it's a very enriching field. And I think that is why I keep at it, and that's why I enjoy what I'm doing.
At the end of the day then, good, bad, uncomfortable, history is still history. For a country to progress, all kinds of history needs to go together, needs to go forward. We need to add more to that repertoire instead of deleting and sanitizing. Manu Pillai, thank you so much for joining me for this episode, and I hope to have more conversations with you again in the future. But for now, thank you for joining me, and hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Jyotsna Mohan, and I'll see you again soon. Thank you for joining. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.